What does it take to migrate an 8-year-old SaaS application from Heroku to Render? Let's dive in step by step and find out. Now, you're probably familiar with Render as one of many recent additions to the platform as a service marketplace, kind of competing for a piece of Heroku's pie in that area, competing with things like Fly.io and Railway as well. And for each of these services, there's plenty of Hello World style demos and articles that walk you through deploying a brand new application that basically does nothing to those platforms. Render, of course, has their own documentation guide walking us through the process, creating a new application. Honeybadger also has a really good article on deploying a fresh Rails application to Render. But what about a real production app with hundreds of customers? An app that's been running on Heroku for 8 years. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to migrate Judoscale, the product that I've worked on for 8 years, from Heroku to Render. So what is Judoscale? Judoscale, the product, is an auto-scaling service for platforms like Heroku, Render, and AWS. It actually works with those platforms. But Judoscale, the application that runs all this, is a Ruby on Rails app that's been running on Heroku since 2016. And in this video, we are going to migrate our staging environment from Heroku to Render. Now, I know you might be thinking, staging? I thought you said we were going to move production. Well, in truth, our staging environment is a bit of a production environment itself. Our staging app actually auto-scales our production app, and our production app auto-scales our staging app. It's fine. But because of that, our staging app actually does a decent bit of traffic. If we dive in here, we can see that right now we are handling about 800 requests per second across 3 web dynos. We've got a couple different worker dynos running. We have a clock process that runs a bunch of scheduled work. And so yes, technically it's our staging environment, but it's not a toy. It's doing some real work. Now let's take a closer look at the setup of our staging app on Heroku here. We see our dyno setup here, and if we look at our add-ons, we're going to notice, yes, we're using Judoscale to auto-scale our staging environment. And then we only have a couple other add-ons. Our database is not in Heroku. Our database is actually handled by a third party. It's a timescale DB database. And likewise, Redis is handled externally as well. We intentionally don't have any of those things as add-ons, and it's going to make this process a lot easier. In fact, the only reason we're using Scout through an add-on instead of signed up directly is because it happens to be a lot cheaper when you install it as a Heroku add-on. And this is really one of the keys to app portability. We want to be able to take our app and move it from Heroku to Render or any other platform without it being a really arduous process. And moving data is an arduous process. We don't have to move data. We can keep our data where it is. And what we're just going to move is our web servers, our worker servers, and our scheduler from Heroku to Render. So that's my recommendation to you. We've kind of already done the hard work of extracting our database into, out of that platform. And we're using limited add-ons. And those that we are, we'll be able to easily reproduce on Render, as we'll see soon. So let's dive into this process. By the end of this video, we are going to have our staging environment completely moved over to Render, including the domain, everything moved over to Render. So let's dive in and make it happen. So the first thing we want to do is create our web service on Render. So I've set up a Render account here. And in fact, I've got both my personal workspace and I created a team for Judoscale here. But instead of just immediately creating a web service, what I want to do, Render recently added the ability to organize services into projects and environments, which I would highly recommend using here. So I'm going to start out, I'm just going to create a project called Judoscale and an environment called staging. And now we've got a place to create our service. So let's go ahead and do that. And we want to create a web service. And it wants to know what GitHub repository. So let's connect to the Judoscale repo. Okay, we need to name our service. And Our services all need to be unique, not just across this project and environment, but across our entire render account. So I like to be pretty explicit here. This is our Judoscale staging web service. Yep, it's a Ruby project. Region, our database lives in AWS US1, Virginia. So we want our app servers to live in the same place. And now it's kind of inferred a build and a run command for us. So this is totally fine. Bundle install and precompiling assets. This is what we need. And then running Puma. I'm actually just going to remove this bit because we don't need it. And let's see. Starter, that's probably going to be fine for what we need. We can always upgrade later. And for environment variables, you know, this is actually one area where render differs pretty significantly from Heroku. On Heroku, you have the concept of an app with all your processes within that app, your web process, your worker processes, and they're all sharing the same environment variables. On render, each service is distinct, but we still want them to share environment variables. Render does have a mechanism to do this called environment groups, ENV groups. So for right now, what I'm actually going to do is get rid of these environment variables. And I don't think there's a way to link it to an environment group right now. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to deploy this with no environment variables, which is going to fail. But that's okay. What we're going to do in the meantime is we'll create that environment group with all the shared environment variables that we want. And then we'll link that environment group to this app. So right now, we don't really need to watch this. We don't really care. What instead we want to do, I want to go back to just our staging environment here, go to ENV groups, and let's create a new environment group. And we need to give our environment group a name. Again, I like to be pretty explicit with this stuff. Judoscale staging. And instead of adding each of them individually, I just want to kind of grab pretty much everything from Heroku. So I'm going to use this add from .env. And now, so it's expecting just key value pairs. And we can actually get that from Heroku. So from the Heroku CLI, if I ask for my config, it's going to return all of our config with colon separated and aligned, not in the format that we need for render. So let's try this again, but with the -s flag. Now we've got them in the format that we need, but we're going to need to massage this list a little bit because we don't want all of these things. I'm going to run this one more time, but pipe it to pb copy to copy it to my clipboard. I'm just going to throw it in a new file here so I can edit these values. Now, specifically what I need to edit out of here is anything specific to Heroku or Heroku add-ons. So let's jump to the top. I know all of these Heroku environment variables can go away. Judoscale, that's an add-on. Liberato, that's an add-on. And then Scout was our other add-ons. Let's jump down to that. Okay, so what we're left with is all of our environment variables from our Heroku staging environment, but nothing Heroku specific. Now we can just copy that, paste that into render, and then we'll be able to link those environment variables to the service we just created. Paste, and say add variables. We have all of our environment variables in there now. We can say create environment group. And now we want to link that environment group to the service that we just created. And of course, it failed to deploy. We knew that it would because it didn't have any of its environment variables that it needed. If we go to environment, now we can see instead of adding environment variables directly here, we can scroll down and we can actually link an environment group. At this point, if we come to the bottom and I thought we'd need to save it somewhere, maybe it's already redeploying. Let's look at events to see if it's redeploying. Okay, so it's already started another deploy. And hopefully this deploy will succeed. We can click this link and actually watch some of the logs here. This is going to take a little bit while it installs everything. And while that's going, let's take a look at what we expect to see once this deploy completes successfully. So what we've got here is the actual Judoscale dashboard. This is our staging environment. And like I said, our staging environment actually auto-scales our production environment. So here we can see our two production applications being auto-scaled by our staging environment. And we can see all of our queue time metrics and throughput metrics in here. You can see our scale going up and down. And this is exactly what we're going to expect to see in our render app once our deploy completes. And we can see in render that our deploy has completed successfully. It says that our site is live. Let's open this in a new tab. And it is running. That's excellent. Let's see if I can log in. Logged in, and it looks like we've got access to all the same data that our Heroku app did. So we've still got a ways to go, but this is a pretty huge milestone. We've got our web service running. We haven't moved a custom domain yet, so that's going to actually point the actual traffic to our render application. We'll come back to that in a bit. What I want to do first is get our worker service up and running, but we're going to deploy our worker service a little bit differently. Render has a pretty neat feature called blueprints, which is Render's approach to infrastructure as code, and it's going to let us describe our services in a YAML file. And in fact, we're going to be able to use that to deploy our worker service without manually stepping through the web UI like we did for the web service. So to get started, I'm actually going to use our web service here. So we're in our staging environment. There's our staging web service. I'm going to generate a blueprint from this file. And so this just basically has all the things that we sort of specified in the web UI. Got the repo, gave it a name, a command, a start command. So what I'm going to do is copy this and then create a render.yaml file in our repo. So in my editor, I'm going to create a new file in the root of our repo called render.yaml. I'm going to paste in what we just copied from render. And I'm just going to do a little bit of massaging here. I'm going to move this version up to the top, remove the comment. Then as soon as I save, it's going to reformat it for me. At this point, we can go ahead and push this. I actually want to commit this file in a new branch. So let's jump over to GitHub Desktop, which I use for Git, create a new branch, bring my changes over. Sure, create render.yaml. That's great. Let's commit that. Let's push that. And now we'll bounce back over to render in the browser. And we should be able to connect a new blueprint. Let's check this out. All right, we're still using the same repository. Blueprint name, let's call this Judoscale blueprint. Actually going to change our branch here. So it found our blueprint YAML, and it's telling us it's going to go ahead and associate our existing web instance to the blueprint, and it's going to change the branch that it deploys from, which is fine for now. Let's go ahead and deploy that blueprint. So while it's doing the work of associating our existing web service with the blueprint and updating it, let's jump into our blueprint and use that to create our worker service. So to create the worker service, what I'm going to do is just start up by copying the web service. Our worker service is not going to be type web, it's going to be type worker. We want the name to be Judoscale staging worker. Everything else is good here. We want it to use the same env group to pick up the same environment variables. The build command and start command are going to be a little bit different. In fact, the build command, we still need it to bundle install, but we don't need it to do the rest of these assets things. That's only relevant for web. And the start command, instead of starting Puma, we actually want to start Sidekick, but we need to tell it which queues to start. So I'm just going to take that from our proc file. So on Heroku, we're actually deploying two separate worker processes, each handling different queues. And for production, we definitely still want that. But for staging, we are fine with just a single worker service handling all these queues. So let's paste these in here. And let's see what we've got here. First of all, both of these proc file commands are starting out with a little bit of gymnastics that lets us customize Rails max threads per process on Heroku. And that lets us customize our Sidekick concurrency per process. We're not tied to, we don't want our web and workers all to use the exact same Rails max threads, which is what determines our concurrency. We want to be able to customize it per process. On render, we actually don't need to do this because we can actually just set Rails max threads directly on a service. So we can totally get rid of that. And then we're just left with bundle exec Sidekick with a bunch of queues. So let's bring that in here. We're going to split this onto separate lines just to make it a little bit easier to read. Okay. You might notice that we have a whole lot of queues, and we typically recommend using a lot fewer queues than this. We've got some reasons for that, but we're not going to go into them here. So let's just accept the fact that we have a lot of queues. I want to organize them a little bit because these queues all deal with ingesting metrics. That needs to happen first. And then we've got our 5-second SLA queue and our half-hour SLA queues, and then default queue, which I don't even think we use, but it's in there, so we're going to keep it. This is it. We've just copied our web service and really just customized mainly the start command. And at this point, we can save this file, we can commit it, and then Render's going to create our worker service for us. We'll push that up. We'll bounce back over to Render. And what we're going to see is, so we're still in our blueprint here, right? And we're seeing, if we look at resources, we can see right now it's just got web. And if we look at syncs, we'll see our first sync was when it created render.yaml. And it synced again when we made the change to add our worker service, but it failed. So let's take a look at that. And this is a failure that I was expecting because I've been through this before. But basically, Render's blueprints feature does not work yet with projects and environments. So when a Render blueprint creates a new service, it creates it outside of a project. So, and since it's being created outside of a project, it doesn't have access to this env group. So we actually kind of need to jump through some hoops here. What we have to do is omit this envars piece. If we push this and we bounce back to our blueprint, so it picked up the change, and let's check out the details here. It is creating our worker this time, which is awesome. The downside is it's not creating it inside of our Judoscale project and staging environment where we want it. It's actually just going to create that Judoscale service as an ungrouped service, which isn't what we want. So what we need to do is manually move it to our Judoscale project and our staging environment. Cool, we've got both of our services in here now. But the worker deploy is going to fail because it actually doesn't have any environment variables. Now we can jump back to the code. We can bring this back, link worker service with env group. This is going to force another deploy. So if we go back to our blueprints, and we take a look at this blueprint, and again, look at our syncs. Okay, we can see that the last sync, it worked. It's got the green check mark. If we look at details, said it had added the environment group to our background worker. And now if we go look at our background worker, I assume we've got a deploy happening. It's going to trigger a deploy when it links that environment group. So one deploy was canceled and another one was started. So this deploy is, I think, still running. Let's see if it's running. Yes, this deploy is still running, which is good. So I'm going to expect this deploy to succeed. And at that point, we're going to have our render worker service actually performing jobs from our Sidekick queues. Okay, so we've deployed our web service and our worker service to render. And we're actually at a point now where we can turn our workers off in Heroku because our render workers are processing through that work in the Sidekick queue. Before we do that, I want to get auto scaling set up for that worker service to make sure that we always have enough services running to get through the queue in a timely fashion. So let's see what that looks like. So when you first sign into Judoscale, or if you already have a Judoscale account and you add a new team, you're going to be prompted to choose your hosting platform. So I'm going to go with render. You're going to need to enter your render API key, and then it's going to show you your teams in render. And if you remember in render, I had my personal workspace and then the Judoscale team workspace. So let's link the Judoscale team workspace here. And so now we see our staging web and our staging worker inside of Judoscale here. We've got Judoscale inside of Judoscale. I know that's confusing, but let's go ahead and set up auto scaling. It's going to ask us some questions. It's a Rails application with Sidekick. It's going to give us some instructions. I've actually, since we were already running on Heroku with Judoscale, these gems are already in place. So I can just say, we're good to go. And sure enough, we're good to go. So within Judoscale, we can see our queue time. This is our Sidekick queue latency here. And we're running one instance. I think I'd actually like for us to be running a minimum of 2 instances. So down here in our auto scaling settings here, I'm going to give a range of 2 instances to, we'll say 6. And everything else is fine. Actually, everything else is not fine. I want to scale up a bit faster than that. And other than that, everything is fine. So if the queue starts to back up, I just want to scale up every 30 seconds until we've caught up. I can now save and enable auto scaling. And what we're going to see really quickly is that since I specified a minimum of 2 instances, Judoscale is right now reaching out to render and scaling us up to 2 instances. So in just a moment, we're going to see this number right here, as it just did, jump to 2 instances. And if we go over to render, back in our dashboard, jump into our project and look at our worker. In the events, you can see instances changed from 1 to 2. So with that in place, now I feel really confident going into Heroku and turning off these workers. Just going to scale them down to 0 because we don't need them. And back in Judoscale, we're going to see our queue latency, our queue time is going to continue to be fine because we've got 2 workers running on render. They are the cheapest machines on render. They're $7 a piece, so I don't mind running 2 of them all the time. We'll scale up if we need more, but this is great. So yeah, at this point, our workers are completely migrated from Heroku to render. We're done with that piece. Now we can go back to the web service and we just need we need auto scaling on the web side, and then we need to set up our custom domain so that our staging traffic is routed there. So to get our web auto scaling set up, I'm just going to go back to our dashboard here and do setup auto scaling on the website. Got to answer the same questions here. Unfortunately, that's something we will fix. And we're good to go once again. We have some metrics. We're not seeing a lot here because our web service is not really getting any traffic. This traffic is the traffic that we sent to it a little bit ago when we were playing around with it. But until we actually update the custom domain, this render web instance really isn't getting any traffic. But even so, I want to go ahead and set up auto scaling. Though these defaults are fine, except I want to, like the workers, I always want to be running at least 2 instances. We get a decent bit of web traffic, so I'll let it scale up to 10 instances if it needs to. Again, they're only $7 instances, so that's a maximum of $70 a month. Once again, I like to scale up faster. At that point, we're good. We can enable auto scaling. So our web services are auto scaling. They're ready for traffic. Now we need to set up the custom domain. All right, to add our custom domain, we are going to go to our web service, to our settings, and we're going to add a custom domain. Pretty simple. We're going to start out with the app subdomain. Save that one. We also need adapter. And now we can copy each of these. Actually, these are the same, so we can just update both of these in Cloudflare. We'll edit the app subdomain. We're going to change its proxy status because render actually uses Cloudflare behind the scenes, so we don't want it to proxy through Cloudflare twice. Let's save that. I've added all the subdomains that we need here. Let's verify these. All right, so checking back on our render staging web service, we can see that we did end up scaling up to 3 instances. That's pretty cool. We were running 3 instances on Heroku, so that's totally fine. I kind of expected that we might be needing 3 instances on render. Okay, so where does that bring us? We've got our worker services running and we turned them off on Heroku. We still need to turn our web services off on Heroku. So let's do that next. We don't need it anymore. We verified that it's not getting any traffic. So we can turn our web service off on Heroku. Before we do that, I want to make sure we're not auto scaling it because it'll just scale it right back up if I try to scale it down. So if I go into our staging environment, let's turn auto scaling off here. So this is our web, or not our web, our Heroku staging. So, and we can see where the traffic dropped off when we changed our DNS. So that's cool, and confirming that throughput is 0. Excellent. Let's go back to Heroku and spin these dynos down. All right, we have one process left. It is our clock file. If you're wondering what a clock file is, let's look at our clock file. This is all of our cron jobs. We use a gem called Ruby Clock, which is awesome. And it just runs all of our scheduled cron tasks. We kind of have a lot of them. And so it's nice to have them all in here. And you know what we're going to do. We're going to add another service in our render YAML file here. So this is, it's not going to be exposed via the web. So a worker is the appropriate type for this, even though it's not a sidekick worker. We'll call it Judoscale staging clock. We're going to have to jump through these nvars hoops again. Remember, if we try to leave this in here when it creates the service, it's not going to work because it's going to create the service ungrouped instead of as part of our project and environment. The start command isn't right. Let's look at our proc file and steal that. Bundle exec clock file.rb. There we go. And now we can save this. So I saved and pushed that render.yaml change, and we can see that our blueprint is syncing. Let's jump into that and get some more details on that. Cool. It is creating our background worker. But remember, it's making it ungrouped, so we need to move it. Let's move it to our Judoscale project, staging environment. Now that we've moved it, we can go back and uncomment this. All right, I pushed that change. Now back in blueprints, we'll see that it picked up that change. And if we view details, we can see that it added that environment group to our background worker. So while that is deploying, let's jump into that service. And we do have a deploy running here. We'll give that a minute to finish. Once that finishes, that is going to be handling all of our clock processes. So we'll be able to spin down our clock process on Heroku. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that because this thing not running for a minute or two is really not going to be a big deal. Spin that down, and this one will deploy. We'll make sure that's successful, and then we're just about done. So we did a lot of stuff here. We have moved our entire staging environment from Heroku to render. The web service, the worker services, the clock service, it's all moved. We have our web and worker services auto-scaling, and it seems to be running great so far. We'll keep an eye on it. What I want to do is come back in a future video. I want to kind of look at maybe comparing the performance, the costs, the deployment speed between Heroku and render. Are we going to move our prod app from Heroku to render? I don't know. I'm kind of leaving that up in the air right now. Right now, I just kind of wanted to get a feel for what it's like to move a real app that's been in production a long time from Heroku to render. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you want to see. If you want me to dig into anything specific or anything that I missed, anything that I glossed over, and we'll see what we can do. All right, I'll see you next time.